The United States just broke a naval blockade using aircraft that first flew during the Carter administration. I know how that sounds. I know your first instinct is to assume I'm about to describe some second-rate skirmish in a forgotten corner of the world. Stay with me, because what happened in the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026 is not a footnote. It is a warning shot, aimed not just at Tehran, but at every defense contractor, every Pentagon procurement office, and every war planner who spent the last 20 years telling the world that the future of naval combat was going to be decided by hypersonic missiles and billion-dollar destroyers. It wasn't. It was decided by a titanium bathtub flying at 300 knots. This is Iron Dispatch. I'm glad you're here. Here's what this story is actually about. It looks like a military story. A few old planes, a lot of dead speedboats, a strait reopened. And on the surface, yes, that's the event. But underneath it, this is a story about the most dangerous kind of institutional arrogance, the arrogance of the expensive, the belief that because something costs more, it must work better, the assumption that a $2 million Tomahawk missile is always the right answer to a $25,000 speedboat. That assumption nearly cost the United States its grip on the most strategically vital 24 miles of ocean on the planet, and the weapon that saved it was a plane the Air Force has been trying to retire for over a decade. Let's go back to the beginning. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the keyhole through which the world's economy passes every single morning. 20% of global oil exports move through that narrow passage, 24 miles at its tightest point, flanked by Iran on the north and Oman on the south. Every supertanker loaded in the Persian Gulf must pass through it. Every barrel of Saudi crude, every Qatari LNG shipment, every Kuwaiti export, all of it funnels through that choke point. The moment that channel becomes contested, the entire global energy market feels it. When it effectively closed, Brent crude hit $119 a barrel. That number is not an abstraction. That is heating bills. That is shipping costs. That is grocery prices. That is the quiet tax that a regional military standoff levies on everyone from Tokyo to Lagos. Iran understood this perfectly. For decades, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, had been building a force specifically designed to exploit one vulnerability, the mismatch between the cost of attack and the cost of defense. Their doctrine is brutally simple. You cannot fight the U.S. Navy in a conventional engagement. You will lose. So you don't fight it conventionally. You swarm it. You harass it. You erode its confidence, drain its ammunition, exhaust its logistics, and eventually, you make the strait so dangerous that commercial shipping simply stops going through it. The fleet they built to execute this doctrine is staggering in its volume. Over 1,000 vessels, Boghammer fast attack craft, Siraj-1 suicide boats, Zulfikar-class platforms, spread across hidden bases along the Iranian coastline. The concept is called mosquito fleet warfare, not one powerful strike, 1,000 tiny cuts. Coordinated swarm attacks involving more than 20 vessels simultaneously, enough to overwhelm any single defensive system, enough to saturate radar, enough to force a defender into impossible triage decisions. Which boat do you shoot first? Which one is the decoy? Which one is carrying explosives? You have 4 seconds to decide. The conventional response to this threat is expensive. Deeply, structurally, prohibitively expensive. A single RIM-116 rolling airframe missile costs roughly $900,000. A Tomahawk costs $2 million. When the threat is a $25,000 fiberglass speedboat packed with explosives, the math breaks down instantly. You cannot sustain a war of attrition when every defensive shot costs 100 times more than what it destroys. Iran knew this. They built their entire naval strategy around this asymmetry, and for a while it was working. Here's the part most coverage gets completely wrong. The crisis in early 2026 was not a sudden escalation. It was the endpoint of a slow, deliberate squeeze that Iran had been applying for months. Commercial vessels began diverting. Insurers began refusing coverage for Hormuz transits. Tanker captains started refusing assignments. The strait didn't close with a dramatic military confrontation. It closed the way most strategic catastrophes happen. Incrementally, quietly, until one morning the shipping lanes were functionally empty and the oil price was screaming the answer that the diplomatic cables had been whispering for weeks. Washington faced a choice. The expensive choice, carrier battle groups, precision strike packages, the full conventional overwhelming force playbook, would have worked, eventually. But it would have taken time. It would have cost a staggering amount, and it would have handed Iran exactly the narrative they wanted. a superpower bringing its most advanced, most lethal, most expensive machinery to bear on a fleet of speedboats. Every tomahawk launched at a bog hammer would be a propaganda victory for Tehran before the debris even settled. So the United States made a different choice. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, called the Warthog by everyone who has ever loved it, is not a glamorous aircraft. It was designed in the early 1970s to kill Soviet tanks in Central Europe, a war that never happened. It is slow. It is ugly. It is built around a gun, the GAU-8A Avenger, a 30mm Gatling cannon that fires 3,900 rounds per minute and is so powerful that the recoil, when fully activated, roughly equals the thrust of one of the plane's two engines. The aircraft is essentially a flying gun mount. The rest of the airframe exists to keep the pilot alive long enough to pull the trigger. 540 kilograms of titanium armor plating surrounding the cockpit, a so-called bathtub that can absorb hits from ground fire and keep flying. For decades, the Pentagon's modernization advocates tried to retire it. It's not stealthy. It's not supersonic. It doesn't fit the future force structure. The F-35 was supposed to replace it. Except the F-35 costs $80 million per unit, requires climate-controlled hangars and an army of specialized technicians, and is extraordinarily ill-suited for the kind of low-altitude, slow-moving, close support work the Warthog was born to do. The Warthog had already proven its worth against maritime targets. In 2011, during Operation Unified Protector over Libya, A-10s destroyed patrol boats and attack craft in and around Misrata Harbor, a preview that almost nobody paid attention to. In 2023, they flew deterrence patrols over the strait as Iran stepped up harassment of commercial vessels. In February 2026, they ran joint exercises with a littoral combat ship, specifically practicing coastal warfare scenarios. 2 weeks later, the exercises became operational. The AH-64 Apache joined them. The Apache's M230 chain gun fires the same 30mm round as the A-10's Avenger, not at 3,900 rounds per minute, but at 620, with 1,200 rounds of capacity. The Apache is a helicopter gunship, slower, lower, more precise at close range, able to hover and acquire targets that a fixed-wing aircraft moving at 300 knots might miss. Together, the Warthog and the Apache formed a two-layer killing system, one working high and fast, one working low and deliberate, both optimized for the exact threat Iran had constructed. The results were not gradual, they were immediate. Within the opening phase of operations in March 2026, the math that Iran had built its entire strategy upon inverted. Iranian vessels that had spent months operating with near impunity suddenly faced aircraft that could identify, acquire, and destroy a speedboat in seconds, at a cost per engagement that was a fraction of any guided missile. The GAU-8A doesn't need a seeker head. It doesn't need GPS coordinates. It needs a pilot, a target, and 4 seconds of trigger time. A bog hammer at full speed is still a large, visible, thermally distinct object in the water. Against a 30mm rotary cannon, it is not a survivable target. According to a statement attributed to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, more than 120 Iranian vessels were damaged or destroyed. Over 16 Iranian watercraft were eliminated in a single-night mining operation interdiction. Iranian Navy major surface assets, including Muj-class frigates, the Alvin-class frigate Sabalan, and the offshore support vessel Makran, were sunk or rendered combat ineffective within the first weeks of direct engagement, some within hours of the fighting starting. The Mosquito fleet concept didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed because the weapon it was designed to exploit, the cost asymmetry of expensive guided munitions versus cheap attack boats, simply wasn't the weapon that showed up. More than 4,000 U.S. Marines were involved in the broader operational picture, 2,200 from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit and additional forces from the 31st MEU. They provided the ground component, the boarding capacity, the amphibious flexibility that turned air dominance into actual control of the waterway rather than just aerial supremacy over it. And here's what nobody is talking about. The implications of this operation extend far beyond the Strait of Hormuz. Every military planner in Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, and Caracas watched this engagement and is now running the same calculation. They built asymmetric swarm concepts on the same foundational assumption Iran did, that the Americans would respond with expensive precision weapons, that the cost imbalance would be exploitable, that quantity would eventually defeat quality. That assumption now has a counter-argument written in the wreckage of 120 vessels at the bottom of a 24-mile strait. The A-10 specifically carries a message that is almost philosophical in its implications. Here is a weapon that the United States military has spent years trying to dispose of. Here is a platform that every serious defense procurement discussion in the last decade treated as obsolete, as a relic, as an embarrassment in an era of fifth-generation stealth fighters. The bureaucratic machinery that wanted it gone was not wrong about everything. It genuinely is slow, genuinely is non-stealthy, genuinely would not survive in a contested high-end air defense environment against a peer adversary. But the Persian Gulf in 2026 was not that environment. The Persian Gulf in 2026 was exactly the environment the A-10 was quietly, patiently waiting for. Low-threat airspace, dense with small, fast surface targets, where the ability to put enormous volumes of accurate 30mm fire onto a boat-sized target in a matter of seconds was more valuable than all the stealth and network integration in the world. Cost matters in warfare. It always has. The most elegant tactical doctrine in history collapses if you cannot afford to execute it repeatedly. 24 miles of contested water costs a lot less to close than it costs to reopen, unless you bring the right tool. And the right tool, it turns out, was the one gathering dust in the Air Force inventory while acquisition officers debated the next generation of everything. The strait is open again. The tankers are moving. The insurance markets have stabilized. The $119 oil spike has retreated. But the lesson has not retreated. It is sitting in planning cells from Taipei to Warsaw to the South China Sea. Every nation that built a swarm doctrine, an asymmetric coastal strategy, a mosquito fleet designed to win by making defense too expensive, they all have the same homework assignment tonight. Rethink the math, because somewhere in a desert airbase that nobody was paying attention to, an ugly, slow, magnificently armored aircraft just rewrote the equation. And the architects of the strategies it destroyed are only now beginning to understand what that means for the next time. The next strait, the next swarm, the next morning when the shipping lanes go quiet and someone has to decide which tool to reach for. The story isn't over. It is barely beginning.